Hi, this is Ben from Aurora Miniatures, and today I'll be showing you how to disassemble the HO GMD SD60F. The recommended tools for performing this task are Phillips head screwdrivers, a plastic pry tool, a pair of tweezers, a hobby knife, and a soft surface to work on, such as a soft foam cradle. The first step is to remove the dynamic brake hatch from the locomotive shell. Then use your plastic pry tool to gently lift and release the ribbon cable connector for the front lights. Turn the locomotive upside down and place it on a soft foam cradle. This next step is optional but highly recommended. Remove the two screws holding the fuel tank to the locomotive chassis and remove the fuel tank. This makes it easier to hold the locomotive chassis while removing the shell. Remove the coupler screw, then remove the coupler box cover from the rear using tweezers. Then also remove the coupler from the front. Then remove the coupler box with the coupler centering spring from the rear as well. Do this for both ends of the locomotive. Grab the locomotive chassis with one hand, then use your other hand to reach into the taper section with your fingers and gently push the front of the locomotive shell out and lift up. The front of the locomotive should begin to detach from the chassis. Be sure that the sanding lines are not caught on the trucks or stuck to the chassis at the jacking pads. If the sanding lines appear to be stuck, use a hobby knife to gently free them and avoid exerting excessive pressure on the sanding lines so that they don't break off. After the front of the shell is lifted off, you can also begin to lift the back of the shell from the chassis. Gently spreading the shell apart at the engine compartment section will help free it from the chassis. If something appears to be stuck, do not use force as it may damage the shell or the chassis. To reassemble the locomotive, the rear of the chassis must be dropped into the shell first at the angle as shown in the video. Use your other hand to gently spread the shell slightly to make this process easier. Ensure that none of the sanding lines on the rear truck are caught between the shell and the chassis during this process. If any sanding lines appear to be caught, you can gently free them using tweezers. After the rear of the chassis is in place, check that none of the sanding lines on the front truck are also caught between the shell and the chassis. Use tweezers to gently free them if necessary. When the rear of the chassis is lined up with the rear pilot of the shell, the front of the chassis should drop freely into the shell. After the chassis is dropped into the shell, check the sanding lines and use tweezers to free any sanding lines which may be stuck between the trucks and the chassis of the locomotive. There should be a sanding line visible at each corner of the trucks. The next step is to reinstall the fuel tank and the couplers on both ends of the locomotive. Then turn the locomotive over, press the ribbon cable for the front lights in place, replace the dynamic brake hatch, and you are done.